I had a chance the other day to sit down with one of my clients, Boomer Cornwell. His first name is Jeffrey. He goes by Boomer. And we talked about his story. When Boomer came to me several years ago as a new client, he candidly told me that he had been in trouble with the federal authorities for healthcare fraud and abuse. He was currently being under indictment for anti-kickback violations or something similar. And so he came to me wanting to engage in a new healthcare endeavor, but was certainly mindful of being compliant and following all the laws. And so we set up a online business, and he was compliant throughout his time with me as a client. Well, fast forward to just a few months ago, last year, he and his business partners were arrested. Initially, we thought he was arrested for some current business practices, but apparently the government was looking at him, and more particularly one of the physicians he was working with, for conduct that had occurred years before. And the government arrested him. He lost his business. He was incarcerated for 6+ months, and he lost everything. And ultimately, the government dismissed the claim because they simply didn't have evidence of his wrongdoing. And so you might ask yourself, how do we get to that point? Why would the government arrest somebody that they didn't have evidence to prosecute? Why would they destroy someone's business and their life when they did not have a rock-solid case? We're going to talk to Boomer about that trying time in his life and some of the lessons that he's learned, and hopefully some of the lessons that we hope other healthcare providers can learn from his experience. Yeah. So I remember I was in the office on February 29th, and as is common, you or your partner would often call me with just various questions about legalities, which was always a hallmark of our relationship. You, from the beginning, from when we first met and you first hired me, your goal was always, hey, I want to do things by the book. I want to, because of your past experience, which we'll talk about, you were very conscientious about not crossing any lines, which was good for me because that's my interest as well. But on February 29th, 2024, I got calls from you and your partner. Things were happening that were completely out of left field for me. Why don't you tell me what happened on that morning?
Sure. Yeah. It started off as a regular morning, like any other morning does. I mean, personally, I'd gone through my typical morning routine, and I remember it being a particularly busy day. And my partner would call me several times throughout the day. So he would call me early, he would call me late. So he was calling me about some other things. And then, typically these calls are kind of back to back to back kind of thing. And so around 9:30, he's calling me again. I'm thinking nothing of it. We had just spoken 5 minutes beforehand, but I didn't think anything of the fact that he was calling me again. And this time he was very, very shaky and very out of sorts talking about it. He goes, the DEA is at my house and my wife is under arrest and she's sitting in the car. And I honestly thought this was a joke. I did not lend any real credence to this at all. I thought he was completely mistaken, or maybe the DEA was mistaken about something. And I said, Clay, you're going to have to tell me a little bit more about this. And so he kind of went.
This was out of left field. I mean, we had not 100%. Had any inquiries, no hints, no emails or letters. No audits were happening, nothing. I mean, just out of the blue, DEA's at the door, people are getting arrested.
We had no idea. I honestly, at this time when he's talking to me, I said, well, they're not in front of my house. I don't know. And I put it back on him. I said, what have you done? You've done something, right? I mean, this has nothing to do with me. They're not over here. They're not at my house. They're at your house, And he says, no, something's wrong. Something's horribly wrong. I think you may be involved too. We got to figure out what this is all about. So the first person we called was Mark, our business manager, thank goodness. And then our next phone call was to you, and I told him, I said, I don't know what's going on. Let's get Wade on the phone and see if he can offer us any insight whatsoever. And I remember we got you on the phone. The first thing you said was, hey, first of all, let's take a breath and calm down. This was so far-fetched, Wade, that our only conclusion at this point, knowing nothing else, was that this was just a horrible mistake. And I remember, we're going back and forth. Like, he's having to jump off and call other people, and he's trying to get in contact with his wife. And then finally he calls me back and he says, I think they're headed to your house. And I'm sitting there thinking, I just cannot imagine what in the world this could possibly be about. They had 2 agents at my house since 3:00 that morning, but they were sitting down the street. And there were some houses down the way that had some construction going on. So they hid their vehicles in amongst the construction vehicles so that nobody would notice anything different. Well, when I went to the gym that morning, I didn't think anything of it. It just looked like construction vehicles sitting there.
Sure.
As it turns out, they had followed me to the gym that morning. They followed me back home. They followed me whenever I took my son to school, followed me all the way back home, and then sat out there. Now, they apparently, for some odd reason, did not obtain a warrant to come into my property. I didn't know what was going on. My wife had just gotten back home from the gym. And I said, look, I don't know what's going on. Something terrible is happening. Just for your protection, you need to leave. Okay, go to your parents' house. The DEA may be on their way over here, and I don't know what that's going to look like, so leave. Well, I work from home, right? So they didn't know. They had to somehow get me out of my house. They did not have a warrant to come up and get me out of my house. I had to leave. And I had to walk off my property so that they could place me under arrest, apparently. And so what they did is they actually decided to use my wife against me. So she's leaving the neighborhood. They apparently had coordinated with the city police department here to go in some way stop her, right? And then what they finally said, the DEA agent finally said, ma'am, we have agents out in front of your house. We need your husband to leave the house. We can't walk up there. He has to walk out of the house. So she said, of course, she's crying and she's calling me and telling me this. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. I'm looking out our front window. There's nobody here. And she says, no, they're there. I promise you have to leave the house. They won't let me leave until you leave the house. And I said, okay. So I walk out. Well, sure enough, as I walk out my front door and I'm on my phone talking to her, I look down the street and 3 white vehicles pull up. 8 federal agents step out of the vehicle, guns drawn, bulletproof vests, the whole thing. This is straight out of a movie. Wait, I mean, I could not have imagined in my wildest dreams that this was going to be happening. Okay, I cannot tell you how completely confused I was about this. And I put my hands up and I put my phone in my pocket, put my hands up, and I'm telling him, I'm saying, guys, I don't know what this is about. You don't need guns. I'm not armed. Please, what is this about? And they, come over to the vehicle. Come on. So I go over to the vehicle. They place me under arrest. They put shackles on my wrists and feet. They place me in the vehicle and they take me up to Sherman, Texas, into the federal courthouse for booking.
So let's stop right there. So people listening to this are hearing this story and they may think, well, gosh, what was Boomer doing to justify all of the indictment and the arrest warrants? So let's explain what your business was at the time. You had a website where you would sell, among other things, supplements, vitamin supplements. And then if patients had a prescription from a physician, you could coordinate a pharmacy to ship the patient testosterone. So the way it would work is if patients came to you interested in some controlled substance, you would refer them to a physician. The physician would conduct a good faith exam, would likely and often get blood tests for purposes of evaluating the patient. If the patient didn't have contraindications for the testosterone or it was medically appropriate, the physician would write a prescription. That prescription would go to the pharmacy and the pharmacy would ship the medication directly to the patient. So you were not distributing, you did not have the possession of any controlled substances, and neither were you distributing controlled substances. This was all happening through licensed pharmacists and licensed physicians. What I think we came to learn later is that the government had no clue what you were actually doing. They had documents from 10 that were 10 years old in some cases, and were extrapolating that you were still operating or that you were operating under those old documents.
Correct. Yeah. So, and to add just a little bit of clarity, I mean, myself and my business partner at the time, we owned a consulting and management company. And Wade actually helped us structure a lot of how we set that up. Because again, to your point, I wanted to be super compliant. I didn't want there to be a hint of a problem anywhere. And so in doing this, we had contracts. We didn't even own any clinics or doctor's offices. We had the exclusive management contracts for a virtual online clinic and then several doctors who had physical locations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And as we would later learn, this was specific to a doctor in one of the locations. And it was actually specific to prescribing habits that he had years before we ever even knew this guy, right? I mean,
so your business was really two businesses. You had a consulting medical management company that you would help manage the practices of physicians, and then you had this online system in place. It really had nothing to do, or very little to do, with your online business. It had more to do with and particularly one physician whose practice you were managing.
From what I could tell from this indictment, they were bringing companies together and people together that didn't make any sense whatsoever. They were trying to connect this doctor at this physical location to the online clinic we were managing. The two had nothing to do with each other. What they were alleging was that the doctor in this case was illegally prescribing controlled medications. And I want to hang out there for just a minute.
Through his practice, nothing to do with this online system.
Right. Correct. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. So they're alleging that he was illegally prescribing controlled medications in his physical location. Again, has nothing to do with the online business or the other physical locations. And then that was going to the pharmacy, that the pharmacy was illegally manufacturing the product. And then that the management and consulting company, were illegally distributing that. Okay. So it was the illegal prescribing, illegal manufacturing, and illegal distributing of it. Okay.
Were y'all distributing at all any controlled substances?
No, we were not. No, we absolutely were not. Only the pharmacy can do that. And what, I explained to my attorney several times that, look, even if we wanted to distribute this, which we didn't, the pharmacy would not have let us. There's no possible way. The pharmacy has a process to get these products and medications to the patient. Why would we need to be involved in that piece of the process? It doesn't make any sense.
And so on February 29th, you were arrested, your business partner and his wife were arrested. Also arrested were the physician, one of the physicians whose practices that you managed, his mid-level provider that
Correct.
Worked for him, not for you.
Right.
And then they also arrested the owners of a pharmacy.
The owners of two pharmacies. Yeah.
Two different pharmacies.
So just to kind of clarify, so that day, there were a total of 9 arrests that were made. There was myself, there was my business partner and his wife. There was the doctor. There was the doctor's wife who was arrested as well. There was the mid-level provider, like you mentioned. There were 2 pharmacies. So there was one owner at one pharmacy that was arrested, and then the other pharmacy had 2 owners that were arrested. So there were 9 total arrests that day, with 2 pharmacies involved. Everybody involved, of course, we had to go to court. They let everybody else other than me, they let them go. They released them on pretrial release. Okay. They did not release me on pretrial release, which we can get into why later. I ended up having to go to a federal detention center that evening, for what ended up being 6.5 months throughout this entire process. I was fully convinced I was only going to be there for a few hours to maybe a couple of days, and then everything would be cleared up. That did not happen. And speaking to my attorney in March now, I had regular communication with him at least. He referenced this reverse proffer meeting. And he said, and I said, tell me what this is about. Tell me what they're going to do. And he goes, well, this is the meeting, for lack of a better term, where typically the prosecution shows up and they're supposed to present their biggest piece of evidence against you. If there's a damning piece of evidence or, a smoking gun, quote unquote, this is when they present that and they tell me what that is. As I followed up with my attorney after this meeting occurred, he came back to me. And remember, this is a guy with 27 years experience, a lot of it as a federal prosecutor, most of it as federal defense. He came to me and said, in all of my years, that was the weakest, most unimpressive reverse proffer meeting I've ever attended. And I said,
Yeah,
well,
when I attended the meeting that I was in, specifically when it got to the online system, the thing that stood out to me most was the investigator or DEA agent said she was allowed to buy controlled substances online, which
mhm,
was not the case at all.
uh,
Had she made any effort to actually use the website, she would have seen all she could do is schedule an appointment with a physician
right.
to conduct a good faith exam. And she would also have to go get a blood test prior to that
Mhm.
examination. So she misrepresented or simply didn't understand what process you guys actually had in place.
What was in the evidence were 6 emails that were sent back to her, not only explaining that she would not receive these products that she's trying to get, but specifically why she was not receiving it. And to your point, it's because she was not set up as a patient. And these emails that they had in their own documentation showed that not only, again, like I say, not only did she not get this stuff, okay, it said, you're not a patient. We don't have current labs on you. You're not considered in good standing. Please click this link and fill out these forms to become a patient. We will get you scheduled. Let us know a good time to contact you. 6 of those emails went back to this agent, and she never responded to any of them.
All right, so you're being detained. So from February 29th, for the next 6.5 months, you were detained. Let's put a pin in this story and talk about why you were detained, which requires us to go back in time to 2019 when you got sucked into yet another or your first experience with this kind of thing. Tell us what happened.
So I worked for a company. It was a local laboratory company. I have 20 plus years in history in medical sales, and typically it's laboratory. So I was approached by this local place. It was a startup in November of 2014, actually. And they offered me a position as vice president of sales. And I accepted that position in December of 2015. I was there for about a year and a half. And during this time, I actually had 2 responsibilities. I was building and leading a sales team, but I was also responsible for going and bringing clients on board to the company. And so in late 2015, there was a client that we were trying to get. He was, she actually had a medical practice out in Fort Worth. It was a family practice. The daughter was the practitioner, the doctor. Her father was the office manager, and her father kind of ran the show and told everybody what they could and could not do. As it turns out, they were looking to, as the office manager made clear, they were looking to get paid for these laboratory referrals, and said, hey, in so many words, if we are going to send all this lab work to your company, then we need some kind of a process and handling payment of some kind. To which I explained that can't happen anymore. The Office of HHS, I guess OIG, sent out a special
Advisory. Yeah.
Special advisory. Thank you. In June of 2014, so not long previous to this, specifically stating that Department of HHS would consider it a violation of the federal anti-kickback law to pay a doctor's office for any type of laboratory referral. And I went over this with him, and he had acknowledged that he had seen the same publication.
So the daughter was the physician, and the mother was the receptionist, and the dad was managing his physician daughter's practice. And so
Correct.
He was the one that was wanting or requesting some kind of kickback or payment for these lab referrals.
Right. Correct. I came back and I had a conversation with our CEO and our head legal counsel. At this time, we had a head legal counsel that would review any type of arrangement or any type of contract with any incoming client. And so I sat there. I remember the conversation well. We sat at this big conference table, and I said, "Listen, there's this office out in Fort Worth. They would do a good volume for us, but I'm going to be honest and tell you, he's looking to get something for this. At least the office manager is, not so much the doctor." And of course, and the CEO at the time and our counselor both all shaking their head. No, we're not doing that. We're not doing that. I said, I know. That's what I told them, that you're not going to do that. And so this new company, at least I was told, did not want to venture into those waters at all. Didn't even want to have the conversations. And I said, listen, I have no problem. I'll go back and tell this guy right now that I'm sorry we can't do business with you. And they said, no, don't worry about that. Go ahead and bring him to the table. Just know we're not going to get into that arrangement. We're not going to touch that. we're not going to be paying kickbacks. You can rest assured that that's not going to happen. Your job as vice president is to bring the client to the table. Our job as leadership and compliance is to assess whether or not we're going to do business with him. So just bring us the client.
Okay, so you were assured by them this wasn't going to happen. Fast forwarding to the story, apparently it did happen.
It did. I ended up leaving the company in April of 2016. I find out through a couple of contacts that I still had there that about 2 to 3 months after I left the company, that this doctor's office and the company did in fact enter into this pay-to-play arrangement. Father that ran the practice set up a draw station. It was a phony draw station, and then would invoice the clinic for blood draws. Okay. And so that's how he determined that they should get paid what ultimately ended up being a kickback. Again, happened after I left the company. Well, I also learned later on down the road that this company was being investigated for not only that, but for some illegal MSO structures that they were engaging in with hospital systems around just really in Texas for the most part. Things kind of began at the company to kind of unravel, and I really began to not even have much contact with the people that I still knew there because I thought, well, the least I know about this, the better. I actually got questioned or contacted by a DOJ official. I guess he was an investigator around 2017, I guess it was. And he wanted to talk to me and ask me some questions. And so I didn't know what to do. I just thought, boy, I probably need to have some legal representation here. I don't know really where this is going to go. So through a couple of contacts, I had gotten in touch with an attorney down in Dallas who specializes mainly in state issue, but he does a little bit of federal now.
And so that happened in 2017.
2017.
And fast forward, you were then indicted in December of 2019. So roughly 2.5 years, almost 3 years after you left that company for conduct that occurred after you had left the company, you were sucked into this. And so when you came to me in 2021, focusing on this online business, this was the motivation for you to do everything by the book, because you had at the time, this was still pending, and it was pending when you reached out to me. It was pending when you were detained on February 29th. Right. And this is why they did not let you go, because you had this prior thing already still pending.
Between the initial conversation with this DOJ agent in 2017, all the way up through the end of 2018, I had another 2 meetings with the federal government during this time that my then attorney, not the same one I have now, but my then attorney told me it was totally safe to take it. And I look at him and I said, hey, isn't there something I can sign? I mean, there's something that I can sign that says because I'm giving these guys a lot of information and I don't want them to turn around and use it against me. So isn't there something I can sign? And my attorney, who had 40 years experience as an attorney, looks at me and he says, Boomer, you've been watching too much TV. That doesn't exist. And I said, okay, I'll take your word for it. But I was convinced he was wrong. Well, it turns out he was wrong. Because what should have been signed prior to me taking these meetings with these federal agents was this reverse proffer agreement, where clearly nothing that I say could be used against me. But because that document was not signed, that information was used against me. And I actually found out on January 8th of 2020, I'll never forget that date, this attorney is calling me, and I never like to receive phone calls from him, especially early in the morning, because it normally was not good news. And he called me and he said, I've got bad news. You're being indicted. And I said, for what? And he said, well, they took all that information that we've been giving them over the past 2 or 3 years, and they decided to go ahead and indict a whole bunch of people, and they decided to make you part of that indictment. It's interesting. The original prosecutor on this first indictment, this is where it gets real convoluted. People have to pay attention.
Oh, this is where.
It gets, yeah, exactly.
It wasn't convoluted already.
Yeah, now the story turns back. So the very first prosecutor on this first case, going back to 2019, was a gentleman out of the Eastern District, a prosecutor. He since, during this whole indictment period, he since took a couple of different promotions. He's now the second guy in charge in the entire Eastern District, okay, like second in command. That'll be relevant later because that's very relevant as to the situation I'm in now.
So let's put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that. I want to pick up on the what we'll call the second indictment, the February 29th arrest, you're in being detained because of this because you got sucked into this prior investigation, and years after you left that company, you were indicted with others from that company. Not only were you detained, though, and that detention kept getting pushed out, so did your trial date for this second indictment.
Correct.
Talk to me about the challenges you had trying to get a speedy trial for this second indictment. You were interested in a speedy trial as quickly as you can because you're in jail. I mean, you want to get out and you want to be vindicated from these allegations. So what were the struggles that you had there?
Well, so you touched on an important, as we would later find out, okay, as my attorney is going through, again, he's the only one that's gone through all this 5 terabytes of stuff, right? As he would later find out, probably a year down the road, he comes back to me and he says, I think I've learned why they involved you in this second indictment. I said, why? He goes, because you had already an indictment pending. He said, in every single document that I've read where your name is referenced, Boomer, it also says in parentheses, Cornwell pending another indictment, and they reference the indictment case number. Okay. So my attorney and me, we are all now fully convinced that the only reason I was even named in the second indictment is because I had the first one pending. And so what they did is they used the fact that I was on pretrial release for that first indictment as a reason to detain me on the second one by saying, hey, since Cornwell is involved in another indictment, this is going to be considered a violation of his pretrial release conditions. So we're going to put him in detention. We're going to detain him. They don't necessarily care about me being detained so much as they do forcing me to plead guilty to something that everybody knew, including myself, obviously, was not the case. I had not committed a crime, and I know that. But that wasn't the point. The point was detain him, make his life miserable, accuse him of money laundering so that he'll just plead guilty to get out of it. That ended up being their entire MO. They never really had much of a structure. To your point, the documents would later determine that I didn't have anything to do with what they were accusing this doctor of doing. I'm in detainment. I want my speedy trial. And then I'm making that point very, very clear because I want out of there. Okay, I ended up spending a total of 201 days in this detention facility, which is 6.5 months.
Ultimately, they dismissed all charges against you for this indictment. They dismissed all the charges against you because they did not have a claim against you. Out of those 9 people that were arrested that day, you were dismissed, correct? With no plea agreement. The pharmacy owners were dismissed, correct?
So the 2 pharmacy owners that owned one of the pharmacies, they were dismissed as well. Yes, correct.
What the nurse practitioner, he pled to a unique charge, which was, I think, probably the lowest charge you could plea to, because that's all the prosecutor could get him to accept. What was it?
So we were all cash, only ever have been cash, only ever will be cash, right? I say that because this nurse practitioner had his own practice up in the Sherman area. He did accept insurance in the Sherman area, and he actually accepted a lot of federal payers. So at the end of the day, when this prosecutor really had nothing on anybody, okay, including the doctor. So they throw a low-level plea deal in front of him and say, here, sign this plea deal, and you'll get your license back and you'll be able to practice and we'll leave you alone. So he ended up pleading guilty to misappropriation of Medicare funds of less than $100. Okay. So, but the whole takeaway here is he pled guilty to something that had nothing to do with the practice that was indicted. He pled guilty to something wholly and completely different that was never a part of the indictment and never part of the original evidence at all.
And so what about your business partner?
My business partner and his wife decided to go ahead and take a low-level plea deal, much like this one from the nurse practitioner, okay? And what they pled guilty to was interfering with mail process of controlled substances. After he pled, and I was able to speak with him again, he finally came clean and said, look, we just wanted this over with. We didn't do anything, and we know you didn't do anything either, but we just wanted this over with. So we just took this plea deal of basically interfering with a mail process whenever these things were
Which I think is a misdemeanor.
It is a class. Yeah, it's a misdemeanor. It was a low-level misdemeanor. The the really well, there's a lot of heartbreaking things about it, but the truly heartbreaking piece of this is everyone's lives were completely destroyed over this indictment that should have never happened. It should have never happened.
Tell me about the impact. Obviously, you were operating the online business. What happened to that business when you and your partner were arrested?
Well, it went away. We thought, I didn't have a lot of contact with him. I'm in the detention center, but my business partner, some of our other managers, and our operations director tried to keep everything afloat. The problem was what the federal government did is they completely made up this charge of money laundering. And the only reason they did that is because they wanted the judge to approve them being able to go in and seize our assets. And so I didn't find out until a couple of days after I was in detainment that all of our assets, all of our bank accounts were seized. Our business assets, all of our business accounts, personal accounts, everything was completely seized by the federal government. All that is to say that the online business, at this point, we didn't care anything about the physical location anymore, right? We cared about our online business and our other physical locations, but we didn't care about this one.
Which was actually moderately successful.
It was.
And then on the day y'all were arrested, they seized all of your assets. And I think to this day, you're still fighting to try to get some of those funds back.
Right. And so the business, but for the fact that the funds were seized, would have absolutely continued. But then we tried for a long time, or I should say they tried, my business partner and the manager, to keep it afloat. In about a 4-week time period went by when finally they came to the conclusion that we have no more money. We can't access our funds. We don't have money to make payroll. So we don't have money to pay the vendors. And so right around, I guess it would be April 1st timeframe, my business partner and our business manager made the decision to close the business down and let everybody go because we just didn't have the money to continue on. If that would not have happened, if they would not have seized those funds, that business would have still been operational today. The online business was growing, so was the physical location, but our future was always going to be the online business. And our dream, what we had worked for, so hard for 4 years to build was gone like that. I mean, in a day. I mean, it's amazing. Something that we worked to build for 4 years was completely gone and dissipated in a 2-week time period. To this day, we've received back some of our personal funds, my wife and I. We have not received any of our business funds back. And here I am over 2 months out, being dismissed, and I still don't have it. It's an extraordinarily difficult process to get it back. And in fact, Wade, as you and I are talking and having this meeting, I'm playing phone tag with the IRS lady who was in charge of trying to get those funds back to me. So we still have the original business funds from our consulting and management business, as well as the business funds from the online clinic business. Neither have been, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and none of this has been returned. And it is an extraordinarily hard, painful, and long process to get that back. And I'm sure I'm not going to get back the interest that the government has made on those funds either while they've held on to it, right?
So the second indictment was dismissed. So that was good. The negatives, obviously, are many from that second indictment. You've lost your business. You're still trying to get funds back. But at least you're no longer in jail and the charges were dismissed. Except this first indictment is still pending. Mm-hmm. And that brings us to this kind of the second foot dropping on the sentencing for this first indictment.
In the second indictment, when that attorney, that prosecutor, decided for whatever reason he needed to dismiss me from this, that requires an approval. He had to take this dismissal to this guy who's the second in command in the Eastern District, and this guy had to approve my dismissal. Okay. Now, this guy who had to approve this dismissal was the original first attorney on this case that's now 5.5 years old.
The first prosecutor.
The first prosecutor, right? He was the original prosecutor on that, and now he's the second in command in this Eastern District, and he's the guy that approves all the dismissals. But he decides, since there was still this pending indictment in this from 2019, that this is the way that we can still stick it to him a little bit. So I then get a phone call from my attorney saying, hey, the judge wants to wrap up this indictment. It's been way too long. He wants to put an end to this. So let's go. So he tells me I've got a sentencing date for July 30th, 2025. So we're a couple of weeks ago now. And I said, okay. I said, what do you think is going to happen? And he says, we're going to have to make sure, because in this original indictment, the government said that they were going to push for no further punishment. They were going to tell the judge that I was helping them, and that they were going to really encourage the judge to not issue any more punishment. As it turns out, they decided to go back and flip-flop on that decision. So my attorney had theorized. He said, listen, he says, I've had a couple of conversations with these guys and this second in command, and they're very upset. And they've made it very clear that they're not going to tell the judge that you helped in any way, and that they're going to recommend the maximum sentence for you. The maximum sentence was 6 months to 1 year. So he said, just be prepared, because we're going to go to sentencing, and they're going to tell the judge that you didn't help when you did. And they're going to tell the judge that they think that the maximum sentence should be levied against you. But Boomer, they're only telling you that because they're upset they had to dismiss you in this other case. It has nothing to do with this first case, really. So we go to sentencing 2 weeks ago on Wednesday, July 30th. And that's exactly what happens. This new prosecutor, who had nothing to do with this case originally, stands up before the judge and says, Cornwell did not help us. We received nothing of value from him. And so we recommend that you levy the maximum sentence against him. Okay. And, of course, I'm upset. My attorney is upset. He's trying to rebut this. He's trying to tell the judge how incorrect this prosecutor was. Ultimately, the bottom line, the judge ends up not giving me the maximum sentence, but he did sentence me to 10 months in federal prison for my involvement in this first indictment. He sentenced me to an additional 3 years probation, a $10,000 fine, and then $45,000 in restitution. So,
all right. And so you've had now two experiences. You had the first experience, which occurred after you had already left that company. And then you weren't indicted for another 2 years. And then there was no resolution for yet another 5 years after that. And
right.
Then the second experience, where you were arrested, your business was destroyed, you were detained for 6 months, and yet you were dismissed with no charges from that experience. And so you've had now two obviously horrific experiences dealing with the government, both of which related to federal fraud and abuse type issues. But if you were to give some other healthcare providers or healthcare business leaders advice in dealing with fraud and abuse issues, or in dealing with the government, what would you want them to know?
You know what? Interestingly enough, I would say, and I'm not just saying this because you're sitting in front of me right now, Wade, I would say go find a really, really good, experienced, and well-versed healthcare compliance attorney to walk you through this entire process, because there are a lot of things that you don't think of. And you almost want to be, you need to be screaming compliance, okay, all over the place. And one of the ways that you do that is by making it very well known that you are working with a healthcare compliance attorney. When I was first contacted by the representative from the DOJ, I had not had an attorney at this point, and I didn't know who to call. I had no clue who to talk to. So when they had contacted me, the only attorney I knew was a contract attorney. And I called him up and I told him what was going on. I said, I know you're not the guy. You do contracts. I get it. But can you refer me? Do you know anybody here? Right. And he helped me kind of through a referral system. But I will never forget what he told me. He goes, Boomer, you need to be very, very careful that this is happening. He goes, you haven't been indicted yet. He goes, be very, very careful. He goes, because this is not a commercial insurance payer. This is not a doctor. This is not a civilian. This is the federal government asking you questions. And if you get your tail in a crack with these guys, it's real hard to get out of it. And a lot of people don't get out of it. So you need to be very careful. And I remember those words today as clearly as when he spoke them to me nearly 10 years ago now.
Even when folks like you come to me and say, we want to do everything compliantly, I can tell them, yes, I can advise you on how to do things compliantly, but at the end of the day, what I think matters less than what some uninformed prosecutor may think.
Right.
So we're kind of restructuring and conducting business to the lowest common denominator of understanding of these complex fraud and abuse laws. Just because they're federal prosecutors doesn't mean they understand them well or
Right.
appreciate them, and the intricacies. And couple that with the fact that they may not have good information about how you're conducting business because they're also relying on investigators who may not understand the process. When ultimately confronted with the prospect of going to trial and having to explain how your conduct violated the health laws or was somehow improper, especially in light of testimony from me about how things were properly structured, I think that was maybe one of the breaking points where they realized, okay, this is not sustainable.
100%. And I told you this too when I told you that I was dismissed that day, that you were a big part of that. You absolutely were, because my attorney made it very clear to the prosecutor that if you move forward with Cornwell and decide not to dismiss him, we will go to trial. He's not taking a plea deal because he didn't do this. In saying that, he also indicated that, look, we are bringing the compliance attorney into this, and to whatever extent he needs to testify on behalf of my client, he will. And I'm convinced, and so is my attorney, my criminal defense attorney, that was one of the catalysts for them saying, never mind, let's just dismiss this guy, right?
So I appreciate your willingness to share your perspective on this. Hopefully, other folks can take it to heart. Good luck with the sentencing that's coming up. I appreciate your willingness to come on and tell others what you went through.
But no, I appreciate that opportunity, and I appreciate you, Wade. You've been a very key role in a lot of the, there's been a lot of pros and cons in this, but you certainly helped. And I think that you've played a pivotal role in my dismissal. In fact, I know you did. And so listen, I appreciate you, and I appreciate your law firm and everything that you've done for us and for letting me talk here today, man. I hope everybody got something out of this.